just one question. I have it on fairly good authority from people who are involved in this program, knowledge testing, that possibly about 50% of addicts who are given the knowledge respond with a craving for a shot. Many of them report that they have a reaction which is somewhat similar to an opiate.
In this sense, then, I was wondering if the conditioning factor, rather than being the actual narcotic or the acquisitory behavior, was the whole gestalt of the narcotic activity. And that instead of being addicted to narcotics, they're addicted to a pattern of behavior or to the needle, as is sometimes said.
The question, I believe, had to do with the reaction of the subjects to the injection of Narline that was given to them. Well, in my paper on the Narline test, I described certain effects of Narline per se, which are like morphine. So I don't think we have to go too much further than that. Narline does have certain properties like morphine. It's a morphine antagonist, but that's only because it's a weak agonist.
And so are you saying this would provoke relapse?
I don't know.
Reinforcement?
It's something that should be considered, and also the mere fact of receiving a shot may evoke a conditioned response. I'd like to know whether if you answer me, whether these subjects are reporting that they felt a craving in the sense of whether reporting a craving similar to that which they had previously when they were abstinent from morphine, or are they reporting an effect like morphine, that is a gratification of the craving?
As I understood it, it was an effect like morphine, but not enough of it.
Yeah.
I'd like to return to note that Dr. Chine has 3 questions hanging over his head, and let him unburden himself on these questions.
I'm not sure that I can reconstruct them by now, but one had to do with the proposition that addiction is still not defined, and I think an implied accusation that in the course of my paper I was using the word in a floating sense. I did exactly to point up the fact that it is a floating word, that its meanings are often quite different, and that our tendency to use the same word for quite different phenomena has some pretty undesirable consequences. As if we use the word addict for anybody who has ever taken a narcotic, and on this basis estimate the gravity of the problem, and then we go ahead and say the problem is grave because every addict is the most severe type of addict. We don't express it in this form, but we act on this premise. Then the result is utter insanity. With regard to what needs to be done by way of definition, I think that it's clear that there are some usages of the word which had best be eliminated altogether, because connotations of repetitive use are so very strong. I think that the connotation of simple dependence developed in the course of one historical episode is not a good connotation for addiction. I still have trouble in getting over that habit of using the word this way, and I will, for instance, say marijuana is not an addictive drug, meaning addictive strictly in the sense of dependency. But I think it's a bad habit, and it's one that I try to rid myself of whenever I catch myself doing it. I think, though, that the term is more or less legitimately applied to quite a variety of cases. I think what we need to do is to distinguish the types. I have a good deal of reason for thinking that the 4 types that I describe represent a good typology. But this still leaves us far from the definition of the specific types, because there are some rather vague words that I used in designating the types. But in effect, in developing the procedural diagnostic rules for saying this is a type 1 case rather than a type 3 case, one proceeds in the direction of sharpening the definitions. There was a second question which had to do with why I think none of us had said very much about the importance of control as the first step. I thought I had. I think Dr. Friedman had. The fact of the matter is that control is not the first step. And the ground on which it was set forth that it has to be the first step is based upon an acceptance of the premises which I was challenging. As the proposition was that the addict is so thoroughly occupied with the pursuit of his supplies that he has no time or energy left to do anything more constructive. Now, he is in part so occupied, I don't mean to suggest that if you gave every addict all the narcotics that he wants, he wouldn't be occupied with looking for narcotics, although in some cases he might even do that because he might not want it from a legitimate source. But it doesn't follow that he would immediately have energy available for constructive enterprise. Many of these people are psychologically sick, and I happen to agree with Dr. Saz that sickness is a bad word to use in the context of mental illness, but it's an easy word to use without getting involved in technicalities. These guys have a great deal that troubles them. One of the basic things that I think that we need to do in connection with those individuals that I call true addicts is to give them a taste of a genuine human, non-manipulative relationship. This is something that they have not had. Somebody who is willing to talk to them and to deal with them and to be friends with them on their own terms, not because he's trying to make them over into his image. They've got to somehow get across that first hurdle of establishing some kind of sense of trust in another human being as a guy who's not trying to use me towards his own ends. This, in the most severe cases of addiction, I would take to be the first step. Unless we can establish that, we've got to help them to grow. These guys have not passed an infantile growth hurdle. So we keep them sick. Now, we may keep them off narcotics, but we have done nothing to help them grow or to develop, to establish any kind of sense of confidence in other human beings, because they are immediately confirmed in all of their relationships with us that here's another guy who is trying to use me towards his own ends. There was a question from Dr. Clausen. Well, this involves clarifying a point about the family study. There was some misunderstanding here. I did not look upon the study of the family as a search for an intervening variable. as I was completely agreed with the proposition that these characteristics are to be found in all kinds of people. The issue that this study was directed at was a relatively crude approach to answering the chicken and egg problem. That is, do they have the personalities that they have as a consequence of addiction, or is there reason to believe that they had it before? If we could reconstruct their histories and show that this increases the probability that they had these characteristics before, then this is so much evidence in that direction, for whatever it's worth. But the question as to why the mystery of the lack of overlap came as a surprise to me. I'm reasonably confident that if we had larger samples, we would have found overlap. But what it means to me is that insofar as this kind of evidence is evidence of the kind of personalities that they have, in effect, their family environments are environments which generate these characteristics, which are to be found in others as well, only in our sample more so. One point here was that the addict group here were genuine, true addicts in my sense of the word. They were all selected as individuals with craving.
It's very late, and I should like to declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Good morning. In opening the second day of the conference, my first assignment is to ask that none of you smoke in this room today. Let me assure you that this does not represent any moral feeling on my part, nor even any deference to the discussion yesterday, but merely the specific request of the public safety officers. When Americans interested in the narcotics problem think of it in international perspective, probably the two places in the world that first come to mind are London and Hong Kong. And those who planned the program today were thoughtful enough to get two people who are outstandingly capable of informing us about the approaches to the problem in those two other parts of the world. The arrangement this morning is to be two papers, each about a half hour, the first by Mr. Leslie T. Wilkins and the second by Dr. E. Long Wei. This to be followed by 5-minute presentations from 4 panelists who will be introduced a little later, and then audience discussion and participation. Mr. Wilkins is the Deputy Director for Research in the Research and Statistics Division of the Home Office, Whitehall, London. Since 1956, he has been in charge of research and the supervision of research teams there. Prior to that, he'd been responsible for social surveys in Britain, and during the war, he was in flying safety research as a statistician. Just a few moments ago, he told some of us that he started out as a statistician in engineering, even before that, but moved over into the human side. He has held numerous appointments and received several awards in statistics. His recent work has particularly emphasized the field of delinquency and crime. We're very pleased to welcome today to speak to us on the subject, the sociological background of the British control system, Mr. Wilkins.
In order to save the use of blackboard or slides, I did produce something like 100 copies of the 2 or 3 diagrams which will apply to some of the later part of what I might have to say. Some of you came early and were rewarded. Perhaps, however, you will not be so ungenerous that you will not share those with other people who may not have been able to get here and to get them. And while I'm discussing the first part of the topic, if you could circulate them along either the columns or the rows, whichever happens to be appropriate, and ensure that people get a glance at the nature of the diagrams. The majority of students of the problem of drug addiction in this country have at different times expressed interest in the fact that the British claim that they have no real problems in this area. A number of people have doubted that claim. Well, I can say that although I have carried out considerable number of research projects in prisons, borsals and approved schools, not to mention probation, and I've been concerned with criminal statistics for some 10 years or more. I've never met a person in the British penal system who's been really worried about the use of drugs. Certainly the number of addicts who find their way into prisons is extremely small, even if one includes the reefer smokers. According to Scher, whose work I'm sure is known to you, we have in England about 500 registered addicts, most of whom, or at least a disproportionate number, he says, are associated with the medical profession. I have no reason to disagree with his description of those facts. Disagreement begins, however, when the system or machinery for addiction control is discussed, and the so-called British system is interpreted. And I do not want this morning to try to add to controversy. I want to try to throw some light on the problems of interpretation which seem to be posed by those who look favorably on the, quotes, so-called British system, quotes, and those who do not. But I don't want to suggest that my country can teach you anything at all. I don't think we've been particularly clever anyway. I think it's possible that conditions in Britain could change very rapidly so that we might be able to learn from what is being done over here. And why I think that is likely will become clear later, perhaps. However, the fact remains that we in Britain at the moment have been extremely fortunate in avoiding the problems of addiction in the last half century or more. I assume that most of you here are aware of the standard publications which describe the, quote, so-called British system. I can say that I have no knowledge whatsoever of any factors which might tend to suggest in any way that these official statements are biased or incorrect in any detail. And in that statement I am speaking as a scientist and not as an official. Drug addiction in Britain is regarded as a medical matter. The medical profession have very considerable freedom to prescribe for any ailment, including addiction, any forms of medical attention, drugs or treatments that are considered to be desirable for the welfare of the patient. Almost all of the population is of course now covered by the National Health Scheme. I've not seen any recent figures, but I know the proportion of private patients is so small that it's statistically difficult to obtain a reliable estimate. But of course, the National Health Scheme cannot be credited with the control of drug addiction. There were very few before the scheme. But I think it's possible that the future control of addiction might be facilitated by certain aspects of the scheme. I don't suppose that will interest many members of the conference, but I could indicate, for example, the Ministry of Health maintains a check on, quotes, excessive prescribing, quotes, by medical practitioners, and sends experts to advise on outstanding cases. And this control covers cost as well as matters of a medical significance. Now, in the arguments between those interested in addiction control in this country from various angles, I've noted that quite a lot has been made of the fact that the British Register of Addicts is not based on a statutory provision requiring registration. Well, of course, that can't very well be avoided with the rest of the system. But I assume that this voluntary nature of the register is often assumed to imply that it's hopelessly inadequate. This doesn't follow. There are many voluntary systems in Britain which seem to work better, even in terms of completeness, than compulsory systems. Take, for example, the Central Criminal Records Office of Scotland Yard, which I know quite well. They cannot really claim statutory provisions for the notifications of offenders. But we have carried out many research tests of this register, and this I speak from research experience, and it is in fact more complete than it's expected to be. There is a list of fingerprintable offences which is supposed to serve as an informal basis for the completion of Scotland Yard, not statutory but for guidance, and the records do in fact not only contain those but other offences also. And the reason for the voluntary nature of the Criminal Records Office is, of course, that the British policy has always been against any national police force. Although Scotland Yard is often thought of as a national centre, in fact it's part of the Metropolitan Police, who cover the London area, and the Metropolitan Police, unlike other police forces throughout the country, are responsible to the Secretary of State for Home Affairs. That is my ministry. Apart from the Conference of Chief Constables, the central control of local police forces is not exercised, although there are inspectors of constabulary, and the chief constables of local authorities regulate their own behaviour through the conference. I think this really adds up to a policy point, that if officials can be persuaded that a particular routine is in the national interest, they will normally accept this fact as controlling their behaviour, and enforcement by statute is both unnecessary and undesirable. So this acceptance of the national interest as a regulator of official and professional behaviour is helpful in the administration in many sectors. I suppose it may spring from the fact that although Britain has no constitution, we behave in a manner which, if anything, is more strictly in accord with our unwritten constitution than we might if one were written. I recall personally finding the unwritten constitution philosophy rather difficult to comprehend when I began my duties in a government department at the end of the war. I'm still not really quite used to the idea. I recall asking my new chief at that time what my terms of reference were, and to my surprise I was told there were none. I was told I had to take due note of precedent, but I could always suggest a modification of precedent if I could think of a good enough reason and back it up with considered argument. To some extent, I think it's unfair to summarize the so-called British system as a lack of system, although that may be quite a good factual comment. I realize, of course, that as soon as one uses the word system, lack of system, they convey different meanings to different people whose background of experience of systems and lack of systems is derived from a different culture. Take this business of precedent. When it's supported by written evidence laid before one at the time of making a decision, it's a very heavy control. especially when the names included in the files are some of the great names of our history. Even the informality of the notes on what we call minute sheets. They're not used in departments here. You tend to pick up the telephone instead, but we tend to scribble a short note in longhand on a facing sheet in the file, and just the comment is made to the topic of the file. You then send that file to whoever you wish to be informed of your thinking on this. But you are not addressing the person. You are addressing the subject, so that you can make quite vicious comment on the subject matter and then mark it to some high official. You're not being insulting to him. You are commenting on the subject. These are these are privileged documents too. And even this informality in the precedent, I think, adds something to it. I remember being concerned about a year or so ago with a parliamentary question regarding attempted suicide, which at that time was still on the statute book, and there had been some research, and the facts were to be presented in the course of the minister's reply. Now, when the file containing this question came to my office, it came tied with files containing the precedents. It's a pile about that high, and somewhere near the centre of the pile was a file in which Winston Churchill had written a minute, that's one of those informal notes, when he was Parliamentary Undersecretary to the Home Office. And then I might say some little time ago. I haven't gone into the history exactly when it was. And there were quite a lot of earlier papers as well. Now, none of these precedents are compulsory considerations. One just considers them. So perhaps the British system, lack of encoded system though it is, provides a powerful control. And whether it will continue to operate in that way, it's difficult to say. I rather tend to think it's a good lack of system to hold on to for as long as it continues to work. And in any case, it should enable changes to be made fairly quickly if necessary. Now that description I want to generalize further. I have made that specific, but the underlying idea runs through the rest of what I want to say. I don't think that the unofficial official system, which is lacking, is any explanation of the absence of addicts. I think there are many other reasons which interrelate with that general philosophy. I want to take my main thesis in this from the theory of perceptual processes. I don't know how familiar my audience is with the theory of perceptual processes, so perhaps in one sentence I should try to summarize this theory. It'll be totally inadequate for those of you who are familiar with it still. The first statement is that all knowledge is obtained indirectly. I think most people will agree with it. The signals we receive through our senses are codes which we decode into our experience in different ways. Perception is the process of observing, recording, and organizing the experience one has with people and things. People do not behave with respect to things as they are, but to things as they perceive them to be. Indeed, it's doubtful there's any meaning in discussing things as they are. There may be some measure of consensus between observers which becomes to be regarded as truth, but there are degrees of subjectivity rather than dichotomy between subjectivity and objectivity. Facetiously, if you have a modern coffee table in your lounge at home and a visitor comes in and perceives it to be a chair, he'll probably sit on it. People behave according to the way in which they perceive things rather than to the way in which they are perceived by other people, or as, quotes, they really are, quotes. Brill, reference 3 on the list that is circulating, records that Dr. Larimore and he on a visit to England were, I quote, unable to find any indication that in fact there exists anywhere in that country the practice of maintaining indefinitely otherwise healthy persons on continued doses of opiates under medical supervision, end of quotes. It might be that the perception of, quotes, otherwise healthy person, quotes, differs between observers. Each medical practitioner has his own views on medical matters, and these are respected in both administration and law. Personally, I doubt that the concept of a person being at the same time, quotes, healthy, quotes, and, quotes, addict, quotes, would fit the British perception of health and addiction. Addiction is by definition an illness and tends to be perceived as such by not only the authorities, but by the lay public. A very small proportion of the lay public, certainly less than 10%, I do not recall the exact figures, I think it's somewhere about 3 or 4%, when asked about a person who takes drugs, made any mention of this being a criminal, or otherwise the 90-odd% regarded this as a sickness. Now this perception may be the most substantial difference between our two countries. There may not be any real difference, but a perceptual difference. You see, no crook even goes out of the way to get sick. He may go out of the way to be wicked. Wickedness may seem attractive because, after all, that is merely culturally defined. And so if you can make sickness come onto that side too, then it may be the perception that is the important thing. Brill, quoting again from the same paper, continues, "It was clear that the British practice with respect to addicts was not fundamentally different from our own, nor did the British medical views on treatment of addicts differ from our own." Now, I can only assume that this difference relates only to what I might call medical factors. Certainly, the penal treatment systems differ, and so does public opinion. Perhaps the perceptual differences then explain more than the procedural differences. Similarly to the point I made earlier between the required systems and the voluntary systems. In other words, public opinion may be more important than public policy. Brill also suggests that the difference in addiction rates between the two countries, quotes, may be part of a broader question in comparative psychiatry, which, for example, also indicates that rates for alcoholism and alcoholic psychosis are lower in the United Kingdom than in the United States, end of quotes. Well, it's certain that the rates for alcoholism are very much lower in England. Exactly how much lower, it's difficult to say. Different estimates can be derived from different types of comparisons. Mental hospital admissions, New York State, for alcoholic psychosis 1959, 1,929. Great Britain, 531, with a population 2.5 times that of New York State. So taking that one indicator suggests the rate for alcoholism is about 1/10 of the rate in the United States. Anyway, it's less. Let's argue about the amount. It's interesting, too, to note that the Jelinek formula, which you know estimates alcoholism from various other indices, does not provide a good estimate in the United Kingdom. Now, this means, of course, that the usual correlates of alcoholism do not apply in Great Britain. In other words, the facts don't hold together in the same way. The facts are their problem, but it doesn't hold together. So it might be assumed, therefore, that I think the image again and the basic perceptual process may afford some sort of explanation of this phenomena also. There must be an explanation, anyway, of large differences of this kind. I wonder whether this is, as Brill suggests, a question in comparative psychiatry, or whether it's a social phenomenon. Or, in my own view, I think it's more likely to be found to run across the various disciplines of the behavioral sciences. Well, I want to try to make some contribution to your thinking on this problem by putting forward a theoretical explanation in the latter half of this talk. I'm not claiming this is true. I'm claiming that it looks to me to be a reasonable theory. It has the advantage of being testable, and the only way of telling whether a theory is a good theory or not is to take it out in the dirty world and try to destroy it. If a theory is incapable of destruction, it's no theory. So I think this is capable of destruction. Whether it's likely to be destroyed or not, I don't know. However, I'm afraid I should have to be a bit dogmatic and not support the 5 postulates that I need in the time available, but I think I can suggest to you that I could make supporting evidence. Well, the first point I would like to make is that the opportunities for obtaining by legitimate means certain quantities of drugs are greater in Britain than in this country. I want to draw your attention to the ratio between the legitimate and illegitimate opportunities. If you look at the first table and the first graph on the papers which were circulated, you will see two lines there which follow each other absolutely together. The number of crimes of stealing from cars has increased enormously, but it is increased only proportional to the opportunities of stealing from cars. This rather gets rid of the argument that crime goes up when our moral values go down, unless you agree that our moral values go down in strict proportion to the number of motor cars going up. So I think I have established there a relationship between opportunity for legitimate and illegitimate means, and that the ratio remains a constant one between opportunities in a stable system. Now, the next argument is that where one has a balance of that type, where one can discuss the phenomenon in terms of a balance between types of opportunities, a small differential change in the balance may have very considerable effect in the outcome. It isn't necessary to show a very large zero-order relationship. This might well be a case where you have a given stimulus which generates a response, but part of that response peels off and feeds in as a further stimulus. So you have a system which, once it becomes unstable, becomes very unstable. Like the problems we had in some of the early designs of ailerons for aircraft. So the first postulate relates to this balance between legitimate and illegitimate opportunities, and to this perhaps being a critical ratio. The second postulate which I need is that people do not play expected values. I need this to discuss the behavior of addicts, but I will make the statement without being able to relate it. I think you will see its relationship perhaps for yourselves. Now, what do we mean by expected values? I think I can illustrate that best by an example, and I will quote Professor Kahn, your strategist, discussing nuclear warfare risks. I quote Professor Kahn. He is talking about nuclear warfare. I will leave the analog to you. There is, he says, one characteristic that many decision makers have. For decision makers, you can insert people, I think. They do not play expected values. Let me illustrate. Suppose you were Premier of an unmentionable place. You were told and believed that under policy A, you would lose $3,000. Under policy B, there was one chance in 10 you would lose $300,000. The expected loss, $30,000. Policy C has one chance in 100 of losing $300 million. Expected loss, $300,000. If you were a reasonable person, as if you were behaving with respect to expected values, you would choose policy A over policy B and policy B over policy C. Still continuing to quote Kahn. But if you were working on these sort of diplomatic exchanges, forget that, but where prestige gets committed, where you have all kinds of public humiliation, you are apt to argue that under policy C there is 99 chances in 100 that you will get away with it, therefore forget about the expected loss. Now I think I don't have to emphasize the analogy there, but let's leave that statement. My third postulate is that definitions are made by cultures, and that cultures vary in their perceptions of forms of behavior, and that some definitions are vestigial traces of different cultures. Diagram 2, the bell-shaped curve, indicates the way in which this may well apply to our different definitions of crime. Then, since perception influences behavior, the definitions, as they become related to perceptions in the culture, have an influence on the behavior of the culture and the subcultures as perceived and defined by the culture itself. The last diagram shows in the first part of the distribution the same definitional cutoff as the explanatory diagram in the static model. But the very fact of making the definition creates a new set of experience or information input in respect to the people so defined, and the systems tend to drift towards their own central tendencies and away from each other. This applies even in politics. If you have a group, I expect you've probably observed this in politics, if you have a sort of club, for example, which ranges from extreme left to extreme right, or perhaps I shouldn't say extreme left to extreme right, that can't happen over here. From extreme left to extreme right, and these are included in the same club. This club is the other side of the Atlantic. Now suppose the extreme left or the extreme right decides that this is not quite the sort of club for them. They form their own club. Then those of the right who form this new club begin to drift more and more towards the right because their reinforcements are being taken, their informational set on which their perceptions are based are being taken from a different reference set from the initial reference set. And that is the general point, and I apply that to the argument of definitions in this setting. Well, now, in summary, I suggest that part of the explanation, or one of the explanations of the differences between addiction and other aspects of crime and other types of behavior too in different cultures, may be that certain types of information and certain systems lead to more acts being perceived as deviant and then defined as deviant, which results in the individual being cut off from the information set or value system of the parent system. This itself then leads to more action being taken against those perceived as deviants, and the individuals so labeled begin to perceive themselves as deviant and refer to the culture which was created by the definition. The self-perception and the action taken by the general society leads to the isolation and alienation of the groups defined as deviant. These groups then develop their own values, which run counter to the values of the parent system, which has defined them as outlaws, or I use that word outlaws because it's very similar to the word outliers, which one can use in the mathematical model for dealing with this particular problem. And the centrifugal forces then develop. The increased deviance demonstrated by the deviant group, which resulted from the fact that they were then taking their information from a different reference set, results in more opposition to the general culture and more forceful action by the conforming groups against the non-conformists. So as you can see, you're now back round to phase one, with part of the response becoming a further stimulus in the set. I don't think this is too surprising. It would be surprising if people who were excluded by any cultural system were to continue to regard themselves as part of the system. For example, I'm not yet a member of the Athenaeum Club. You've probably heard of the Athenaeum. It's the highest status club in England. Well, therefore, there's no reason really why I should abide by the rules and regulations of the Athenaeum Club. I belong to the Commonwealth Club. I'm quite prepared to be bound by the rules and regulations of the Commonwealth Club. Of course, it has nothing like the status. It even has women in its dining room. But I'm quite sure that if I had been blackballed from a club, I should be have much less interest in its rules and regulations. So perhaps the controls of society can only be effectively operated upon those people who perceive themselves to be members of that society.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilkins, for that most stimulating paper and so interestingly presented. Our second address this morning is by Dr. E. Long Wei, who is professor and vice chairman in the Department of Pharmacology at the School of Medicine and School of Pharmacology at one of the other universities of California in San Francisco. Dr. Wei is one of those rather unusual residents of California who was born here, received all of his formal education in California, and has spent most of his professional career in California at the University in San Francisco. However, he has also held academic posts at other universities in this country and abroad, and particularly during the immediate past year, he has been visiting professor of pharmacology at the University of Hong Kong. He will speak to us this morning on treatment and control of drug addiction in Hong Kong. Dr. Wei.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, that other university in San Francisco we usually call Superior, California. I've had the pleasure of spending a sabbatical leave at the University of Hong Kong to study certain aspects of the problem there, and I've had a very interesting time. I think perhaps one of the reasons I was asked to speak is because Hong Kong uses the British system. The laws are very similar, and yet the problem is a very serious one in Hong Kong. And I think the problem is in part, in large part, due to the peculiar economy of Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a free port, and the well-being of Hong Kong is dependent upon the free flow of commodities through Hong Kong. And to encourage this, it has been the policy of the Hong Kong government to exercise a minimum of control over the movement of goods in and out of Hong Kong. International traffickers in narcotic drugs have exploited the liberal trade regulations and port facilities of Hong Kong to make the city, the colony, one of the more notorious centers for narcotic traffic and abuse. I should like to tell you briefly in this limited time about the complexities and difficulties of the problem in Hong Kong and some of the measures that the government has taken to combat this. And I would like to acknowledge the assistance and cooperation of the Hong Kong authorities in allowing me to divulge much of this information. The magnitude of the problem, of course, is reflected chiefly by the high incidence of narcotic addiction in the colony. While it is not possible to obtain absolutely accurate figures, a rough estimate can be made from prison statistics. A government report in 1959 suggested a figure of 150,000. But with the information that has been made available since then, some of the authorities guess that 100,000 would be a more reasonable estimate. The estimate is based on the annual number of narcotic convictions, which run in the neighborhood of 10,000. Roughly 60% of the prison inmates are drug addicts. If the assumption is made that the number of repeat narcotic convictions is balanced by an equal number of addicts who are not sent to prison because they are fined or because they succeed in keeping their habit secret, then the number convicted annually would represent the number of new addicts for the year. And so if you figure on, say, a 10-year life, that would be roughly 100,000. A figure of 100,000 would mean that approximately 1 out of every 8 male adult in Hong Kong is a drug addict. Such a ratio can easily be calculated from the population and prison statistics of Hong Kong, which are considered to be reasonably accurate. The population of Hong Kong is 3.5 million, and of the total male population, about 1/2 are of the age 20 years and over. The prison records indicate that addiction in males under 20 is rather rare, and addiction in females is also relatively rare. So that if we neglect these two groups, which probably represent no more than 5% of the total addict population, there would be about 100,000 addicts among the 800,000 males of 20 years or older in Hong Kong. Largest number of addicts are in the age group 35 to 50, and then 20 to 34. The incidence in the age group 16 to 19 consistently runs less than 0.5% of the total addict population. The vast number of addicts come from 3 main occupational classifications. The vast majority of addicts come from 3 main occupational groups: laborers, street vendors, and skilled workers. By skilled workers, we usually include such as tailors, barbers, carpenters, etc. Most of the female addicts are prostitutes, but it's not known accurately whether they entered their profession before or after they acquired the habit. The reasons usually given for the addiction, one is as an anti-fatigue drug. For example, the tailors who get a 24-hour rush job for a suit, they claim that the only way they can keep awake to finish the job is to resort either to opium or heroin. Or some of them take it as an anti-anxiety. Some of those who are in construction work feel that they are unable to do some of the construction work from great heights unless they have the drug. I suspect, however, that a large number become addicts purely from a social reason, especially among the uneducated group. Smoking of opium and the inhaling of heroin, for example, is socially acceptable, although it is not among the educated class. So that groups will get together to have the equivalent of a cocktail party, so to speak, and instead they would smoke heroin or smoke opium or inhale heroin. Some give as a reason, as purely a sexual one, to prolong the sexual act. The majority of addicts, about 2/3 of them, are consumers of heroin. About 1/3 still use opium. Addiction to the synthetic surrogates of morphine is almost non-existent. The popularity of heroin is undoubtedly related to security and economic matters. The increased effort of the Hong Kong government to suppress opium smoking has resulted in the unfortunate consequence of drug traffickers and addicts turning to heroin, which is much easier to smuggle and conceal. And then, too, the development of tolerance to opium has necessitated many addicts to resort to the more potent heroin to sustain their craving. Narcotic drugs are used in many ways. Opium is generally smoked with a special pipe, which is preceded by a ceremonial heating process. There are a few who swallow opium. Heroin can be injected intravenously or intramuscularly, as is so popular here in the States, but more generally, the effects of heroin are obtained by inhalation. And the addicts have their own parlance to describe the different modes of inhalation. The mildest form is by ack-ack, or firing the anti-aircraft gun. This is a procedure where the lighted end of a cigarette is dipped into heroin powder, and in order to keep the heroin from falling off, the cigarette is smoked with the head tilted slightly backwards, hence firing the anti-aircraft gun. A variant of Ack is smoking cigarettes containing heroin concealed within the tobacco, and many addicts claim that they were unknowingly introduced to the habit in such a manner. The more sophisticated way to inhale heroin is by chasing the dragon or playing the mouth organ. And this may have been introduced to Hong Kong prior to the war from Shanghai. Both processes are basically similar. Several granules of heroin, and generally dyed red, and it's usually called hong gai or red chicken, are mixed with several parts of barbital and placed on a piece of tin foil folded longitudinally. The mixture is then heated gently with a lighted match on a taper, and as it melts, the molten mass is made to run slowly up and down the tin foil by alternately tilting each end. The barbital and the heating process serves to prevent the rapid decomposition of heroin. As the molten mass rolls slowly back and forth, the addict inhales the fumes which evolve. The fume takes the shape of the undulating tail of a dragon, hence chasing the dragon. The fumes may be inhaled without the aid of an instrument, but generally a straw, rolled paper, or bamboo tube is used. If the fumes are inhaled through a matchbox cover, this is called playing the mouth organ. Each variant requires considerable skill to prevent irritation from the fumes and waste of the material. The process generally can be completed within a few minutes, but some of the more adroit inhalers maintain that they can chase the dragons for hours at a time. Dragon chasing usually begins when tolerance to opium or Ack develops, and usually ends when the addict shifts to heroin injection to sustain his cravings. However, many opium smokers and many dragon chasers have been satisfied with their particular mode of taking either opium or heroin, and have maintained that have maintained their own particular habit for several years without need to resort to heroin injection. An important factor upon which the habit is dependent is the earning capacity of the addict. When his daily income is used entirely to sustain his cravings, either the addict is content to maintain his habit at this level, or he shifts to taking heroin by another procedure which gives greater effects. The heroin taken by injection or Ack is not the adulterated material seen in the States. The number 4 powder, or white powder as it is called, is high-grade heroin hydrochloride and is generally more than 90% pure. And the red chicken for dragon chasing usually contains about 65% of heroin. The heroin is dispensed in small packets containing about 40 or 80 milligrams. And a packet of 40 milligrams costs 1 Hong Kong dollar, or that is about 17 cents. And the 80 milligram packet costs 2 Hong Kong dollars, or 35 cents. If the material is used for dragon chasing, another packet containing 100 to 200 milligrams of barbital is generally furnished without additional charge. Most addicts use between 100 to 500 milligrams of heroin daily, and taking one or two packets 3 or 4 times a day. The cost of the habit runs somewhere between, in terms of U.S. money, 60 cents to $3, but most addicts spend about the equivalent of $1 US a day. So much for the habit. The control. The Hong Kong government, through the United Kingdom, is a signatory to the various conventions and agreements adopted by the international bodies for the control of narcotic traffic, and also it reports annually to the Commission on Narcotic Drugs of the United Nations. The cultivation of opium, manufacture of narcotics, possession of drugs unless authorized by the Director of Medical and Health Services, and the consumption of opium or heroin are liable to maximum penalties of Hong Kong $100,000, which is U.S. $17,000 fine, and imprisonment for 15 years. However, the maximum penalties are seldom set for these offenses for various reasons, and usually with good cause. In many instances, those arrested for the manufacture of heroin are usually refugees from the mainland committing their first offense, and the big operator behind the scenes, who well may be masking as a respectable member of the community, is seldom apprehended. To arrest and vigorously prosecute the mere users would flood the prisons and overtax law enforcement officials and existing facilities. In general, those who are charged with possession of narcotics have sufficient amounts on their person or premises to indicate that they are peddling or manufacturing narcotics. These people are dealt with more harshly, and the punishment is roughly proportional to the amount of evidence seized and the number of previous convictions. Repeated offenses are more likely to be among those who peddle heroin because many of these are also addicts. Hong Kong is not an opium-producing area, but they do manufacture heroin from morphine, which is smuggled in. The opium which is smuggled in is just generally used for the use of the addicts. The morphine and opium comes mainly probably from Yunnan, a province in mainland of China, Laos, Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam. The geographic situation of Hong Kong, coupled with its free port facilities, make Hong Kong an ideal transit center for narcotics throughout the world. And some of the smuggling occurs through the mail and by aircraft, but most of the smuggling is by sea. The control of this illicit traffic in narcotics is under two agencies, the Preventive Service and the Hong Kong Police. The interception of smugglers and their contraband is undertaken by the Preventive Service of the Commerce and Industry Department. During the year, they routinely search about 4,000 ocean-going vessels, 20,000 small local boats, about 1,500 aircraft, and 900 land vehicles. Watch is maintained on about 400 ocean-going vessels, and approximately 1,000 searches are conducted on ferry steamships plying back and forth between Macau and Hong Kong. About two or three seizures are made a month, and the amount seized varies widely. Roughly about 1 to 3,000 pounds of opium, 1 to 300 pounds of morphine, and little less than 100 pounds of heroin are seized within a year. The police force handles narcotic violations occurring within the colony, and here the amount of heroin seized is generally higher than that by the Preventive Service because, as I've indicated, considerable manufacture of heroin from morphine goes on in the colony. But the amount of opium seized is far less because it is used up. The arrests for narcotic violations number about 40 each day. Successful raids on manufacturers or traffickers run about 1 to 2 a month. The intelligence work is done by the Narcotic Bureau of the police force, and the Bureau also coordinates the activities of the Preventive Service and that with Interpol. And so that although many of the seizures are made after routine surveillance and search, but many of the larger ones are mostly made after tips from informers. Now, as to treatment, most of the convicted addicts are usually withdrawn from narcotics at the various prisons of the colony under medical supervision, after which they usually after which they enter the usual prison routine for the duration of their sentence. Many inmates convicted for offenses other than narcotic violations often unknowingly become withdrawn from narcotics while waiting for trial or sentencing. However, some may approximately 60% of the prisoners, as I've indicated, are drug addicts, and since they are permitted to see visitors, it is extremely difficult to maintain maximum security conditions with respect to preventing narcotics from entering the prison. And in isolated instances also, warders of the prison have been convicted for passing narcotics to inmates, so that many of the city prisons, the addicts are still able to maintain their habit. The Commissioner of Prisons, because of these problems, proposed the creation of an open-air prison for drug addicts. And as a consequence, Tai Lam Prison was established near Castle Peak in 1958. Tai Lam Prison is a special prison for the treatment of addicts, so that it is part prison and part hospital. And usually, since its inception, over 8,000 addicts have been treated there. Between 1,500 to 2,000 prisoners are admitted and discharged from the prison annually, and the average daily population is maintained at about 700. The inmates are in large part those who have been imprisoned for narcotic offenses, but many other prisoners sent there were convicted for other crimes and were subsequently found to be addicts after their incarceration. The prisoners selected for Tai Lam are considered to have a reasonably good chance for rehabilitation. Generally speaking, the sentence imposed upon these individuals is for at least 4 months, which is a period believed to be necessary for their rehabilitation. However, the nature of their crimes may often require a commitment for as long as 2 years and sometimes even longer. Addicts are hospitalized at Tai Lam are hospitalized and withdrawn upon arrival. However, some may have arrived already partially withdrawn. Withdrawal is done under the supervision of a medical officer who generally uses only chlorpromazine and psychotherapy for the alleviation of abstinence signs. After a few days, the withdrawn addict is given light outdoor work and subsequently heavier work. And the assignment is based on his physical condition, age, and experience. The work usually includes outdoor work as forestation, construction work on roads, building, fire barriers, and so forth. Upon discharge, there are 4 full-time social welfare workers following up the cases. However, I have not seen any of the statistics on this. There is an aftercare system for those prisoners who voluntarily indicate that they wish to be supervised for 12 months after their release. I have not seen the actual follow-up statistics with respect to the program, so I do not feel that I have sufficient information with respect to how successful it is. In a recent press release, however, the Commissioner of Prison stated that 68% of the addicts who passed through Tai Lam have not been convicted again, and of the 160 ex-convicts who submitted voluntarily for supervision, only 20 have relapsed. However, the duration for which they have abstained from the drug has not been given, so that it is possible that someone, if the statistics were taken on some of the addicts who have been released only a week or two, they would also be included in the figures to build them up. So I do not place too much credence on these figures. I've had the opportunity to visit the prison, and I am quite impressed with the fineness and neatness of the facilities and by the discipline and the program that was maintained there. And I would think that the prisoners would have obtained some strengthening of their moral fiber during their enforced stay at Tai Lam. However, as I say, How successful this program is cannot be fully assessed until there is more detailed follow-up data. Another place for treatment that has just recently opened is an island called Xiakujiao. This was opened by a group of civic-minded individuals who were met in 1959. They were, at least they were inaugurated officially in 1959. They had informal discussions before then. And this group is known as SARTA, that is the Society for the Aid and Rehabilitation of the Drug Addict. And since its inception, SARTA has concerned itself primarily with providing a suitable institution where drug addicts can volunteer for treatment and rehabilitation, because they were disturbed by the fact that at that time, any addict wishing to be cured of on his own would have to go to prison first. And so that they undertook to raise funds, and they were quite successful in this. And I just left Hong Kong right after the dedication of this island, this facilities, which has facilities for, at the present, 250 addicts, and it is, and they propose to enlarge this in the future to 500. This is a little island that is located about 10 miles from the business center of Hong Kong. And I'm sure that this island will have some growing pains, the facilities there on the program. At present, the withdrawal of the addicts are done at Castle Peak Hospital. Then after they are at the Castle Peak Mental Hospital for a month, then they will be shifted to Xiakujiao. Now, Castle Peak Hospital is also known as the Drug Addiction Treatment and Rehabilitation Center. And Castle Peak Hospital is an institution with about 1,000 beds, and is set up primarily by the government for the treatment of mental diseases. And it's located about 20 miles from the heart of Hong Kong. However, they have a block, or they call it a building, a block that is with 30 beds each, which have been set aside for the treatment of male drug addicts. However, it is possible to accommodate 60 addicts in each block, but at the present time, there are 60 addicts, 60 addicts in the blocks. There has been and still is a long waiting list for admission to Castle Peak. And with the exception of the first 60 cases, patients have been carefully screened for admission at the clinic, at the addiction clinic at the Hong Kong Neuropsychiatric Center. And this is usually only after intensive interview with the applicant and sometime his wife and relatives, by an almoner, which social worker, and by a psychiatrist. And the patient must sign a formal agreement of his willingness to remain for treatment for a period of 6 months. The treatment consists of withdrawal and then rehabilitation under complete medical supervision. The withdrawal from heroin may be immediate or gradual, depending upon the severity of the abstinence syndrome, but more or less they follow the Lexington procedure, and may use methadone if withdrawal symptoms become severe. After about 2 weeks, then the addicts are brought into an active program of occupational and recreational therapy. I won't mention all the types of recreation and work that they have. Time's running short. But the social worker who interviewed the patient maintains rapport with the patient by visiting the ward once a week. And the social worker, or almoner, attempts to reduce the patient's anxiety about his home to a minimum, so that wives and mothers are advised to approach the social worker first with their problem. And if in case of disturbed relationships between the addict and the family, the social worker attempts to help the relative have a better understanding of the addict and his problem, and try to help the patient, give him something to look forward to in the future. At the end of 5 months, the patient is given a 2-day probationary leave, and upon his return, he is tested for narcotic usage by the nalorphine pupil test. If he is negative, 1 month later, he is given a second trial leave of 7 days. And after he returns, and there is no evidence that he has used narcotics, the patient is discharged. After being discharged, he is instructed to visit the social worker once a week for 3 months, after which the visits can be reduced to once a month. If the patient obtains employment and is unable to come, then his wife or relative is asked to report to the social worker. Rehabilitation for the addict is not easy during this period, inasmuch as many ex-addicts are asked to prove themselves before they will be assigned jobs commensurate with their ability. During this trial period, the addict may be required to work long hours at a job which he considers below his standard. And this is apparently the crucial period when the addict leans heavily on the social worker. And the addict is also encouraged by the social worker to meet weekly with other discharged patients who have been encouraged to form a club. The Castle Peak program also includes studies on the etiology of drug addiction, and to this end, the epidemiology of drug addiction is being studied to identify situations in which high rates of incidence are found. Socioeconomic data are gathered to ascertain the degree of social deterioration that may attend addiction, and psychiatric studies are being conducted to assess the personality of the addict, to determine initiating factors of addiction, to study the stabilized narcotic users as opposed to addicts, and to assess aversion treatment for preventing relapses. Pharmacologic studies are being made to develop and evaluate methods for detecting narcotic usage and the efficiency of different modes of drug intake. A major and one of the most important projects is the intense follow-up study, which should reveal much information concerning the successfulness or inadequacy of the program. The result of the follow-up study to date, although preliminary in nature, yields some information of interest. Of the 198 patients that have been admitted, 43% have abstained from the drug for a period of at least 3 months or longer. 116 patients have been discharged for over a year, and in this group, 32% have not felt the need to go back to narcotics. As I say, this program is still, they're still making their assessment, and this is preliminary information. There's one other group that I'll talk about only briefly, and this is the Puisan Fraternal Association. It's known as Addicts Anonymous, and it's composed of ex-addicts that who have been discharged from Castle Peak Hospital. They were encouraged to form this club by the Castle Peak authorities, and they have been sponsored by one of the religious organizations, the Lutheran World Service. It was only inaugurated in December, so at the present time, there is no information yet how successful the program is, but there are 100 members. In summary, then, Hong Kong has a very serious narcotic problem, which is obvious from the high incidence, but as I've indicated, the government has taken some very positive steps to improve the care of the addicts. And on the whole, I think the medical treatment program is a fairly realistic one, and the attitude has been rather sensible toward the addict. However, I think there is a deficiency in the aftercare program, and I think the government is taking some steps to ameliorate this. I think there their efforts to educate the people as to some of the, to change the social attitude of the, for opium smoking. As you know, in the olden days, was socially acceptable to smoke opium, and I think they have made some progress in this regard, although I think they have a long way to go yet. They do need adequate facilities for the treatment of female addicts. At the present, the female addict is treated in the prison, and she has no special opportunities to rehabilitate herself like her male counterpart. While it's true that the number of female addicts is small in comparison to the number of male addicts, still the numbers run in hundreds, and it appears unfair to neglect these unfortunates merely because of their sex, especially those women who voluntarily wish to be cured. Finally, although I think they have a very nice program at Castle Peak Hospital, they do not have full-time personnel on the drug addiction ward. I think this is a deficiency, and I think their junior staff is fairly isolated. They do not have too much contact yet, but I think in the future, as they develop their program, I'm sure that they will send some of their staff members to meet and discuss their mutual problems with other workers in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Way, for that fascinating and encouraging report of recent efforts to control drug addiction in Hong Kong. Before opening up the session for general questioning and discussion, we're going to have brief commentaries from 4 panelists, all of whom we met yesterday. The first, Leon Brill, Project Director of the Washington Heights Rehabilitation Center, New York City. Mr. Brill.
Since I am not a sociologist, I'm not prepared to discuss the fuller implications of Mr. Wilkins' paper. However, I have been associated with follow-up studies and rehabilitative studies for a number of years, and I was tremendously impressed by the viewpoints expressed, especially the emphasis on the perceptual processes and the balance between what Mr. Wilkins called the balance between legitimate and illegitimate opportunities. I think the perceptual process does get to the heart of our problem here in America, how we have perceived the addiction problem and the consequences resulting from this perception of the narcotic addiction problem. There are other aspects too which could be developed, how a middle-class society is reflected in the deviant society, and how a middle-class society also sees a working-class society, which comprises the largest segment of the drug addiction problem. Before I continue, I should say that I am not the Brill referred to in Mr. Wilkins' paper. This is my namesake, Dr. Henry Brill of the New York State Department of Mental Hygiene. As you may know, he wrote a highly publicized paper with Dr. Larimore, which has been the basis for much discussion since, I imagine, about 1958. I was very much interested in the statements and the belief of Mr. Wilkins that there are some real differences in the perception of the problem in terms of the greater involvement of the medical profession, in terms of the more tolerant public attitude displayed, and in terms of the clearer image of the drug addict as a sick person. I believe in recent years we have been growing to see the addict more clearly as a sick person, and this has been reflected in my own locality in New York City, and the fact that the New York City Department of Health, the New York City Department of Hospitals have assumed formal responsibility for this problem. And the last 2 years, as Dr. Meiselas will tell you this afternoon, the state, and primarily the State Department of Mental Hygiene, has assumed responsibility too for this problem, first under the voluntary petition commitment procedure, which was initiated in January 1962, and more recently, in January 1963, under the Metcalfe-Volcker legislation providing for civil commitment of arrested addicts for periods of 3 years. I have an interesting report here which confirms many of the remarks made by Mr. Wilkins in relation to the different climate in England. It is called the Report of the Interdepartmental Committee on Drug Addiction, United Kingdom, and it was printed in the United Nations Bulletin on Narcotics, April-June 1962. I don't have time to read extensively from it, but there was a learned council here, an august council, which got together to evaluate the problem at that time. And they do say in Great Britain the incidence of addiction to drugs controlled under the Dangerous Drugs Act 1951 is still very small and traffic in illicit supplies almost negligible. 2, while there is no registration of addicts nor any official allocation of drugs to them on that basis, the departmental arrangements ensure that nearly all addicts to dangerous drugs are known. 3, addiction should be regarded as an expression of mental disorder rather than a form of criminal behavior. 5, I'm skipping here, there is no advantage in abrupt withdrawal of a drug from patient. 8, continued support and guidance should be available locally when a patient leaves a hospital. A system of registration of addicts would not be desirable or helpful. It is doubtful whether a person who is unable to abandon a drug originally prescribed for a condition which still persists should be described as an addict. It is accepted that such a person may be able to lead a reasonably satisfactory life on a small and regular dose of a narcotic drug, but they may be unable to do so if it be withdrawn. I would commend this to your attention for a fuller statement of the problem and the climate in England. To get back to Mr. Wilkins' description of the perceptual processes, I do feel that he has come to the heart of our problem in terms of how we have seen the problem. It is the old saying, you can call a man a dog and hang him for it. We can create a problem. In a sense, we can create an anti-society within our own society. This society or the deviant group or subculture becomes encapsulated, and then belatedly we try to make efforts to break through to it and bring them back into our main society again. And as you know, it is better to try to prevent than to cure. One such project locally in New York City is the Mobilization for Youth, where a tremendous amount of money is being expended trying to recapture a large segment of the population and bring them back into the mainstream of our culture. I think it is very important to understand the relationship between the larger society and these deviant groups. This is obvious. We also have to understand how this deviant group, in a very distorted way, reflects our own cultural goals. There have been many sociologists who have written very well, and I don't have time to talk more about this, but Mr. Wilkins has referred to some of them in his paper, Cloward Olin, Merton, Durkheim, and the concept of anomie. And I would add one to this group, Walter Miller, who describes how we distort in looking at different classes, how the middle class sees working class patterns in a very distorted way, and we fail to distinguish between what is healthy and a way of life in this working class culture, and we tend to label sick and distorted. Of course, others like Hollingshead and Redley have written very well about this too. For example, Mr. Miller points out that we have 25 female-based households, as he calls them, in our society. In other words, this has been a way of life for many, many decades, 25 million units of this kind. And yet we still tend to use judgmental terms for this group. We call it broken homes, and we have all kinds of other attitudes which reflect a lack of understanding that this is a way of life. I would like to read from a statement from Walter Miller, who has done such interesting work in Roxbury, Massachusetts, with criminal and other deviant groups. As he says, in the first place, it is vital to distinguish between what are really problems to the lower class community and what appear to be problems because of an implicit comparison with features of middle class culture. Many terms commonly used to refer to prevalent features of lower class culture contain a, quote, built-in cultural bias which causes an observed feature of behavioral patterns automatically to appear as deviant or pathological as soon as it is described. For example, the female-based household is generally called a broken home. The serial monogamy marriage pattern is termed desertion. Certain social arrangements of lower class communities are called, quote, community disorganization. The widespread and highly functional adolescent street corner group is termed the delinquent gang, and Walter Miller does point out that with the hostility which many of the mothers in these so-called broken homes have towards males, the street corner serves a very constructive purpose for males growing up in this society in terms of helping them achieve their masculine identification. But we tend to see this as an antisocial group and a delinquent gang. Aggressive and other forms of behavior in active conformity with standards of the individual's most immediate and significance reference groups are called, quotes, antisocial. In evaluating or diagnosing a given set of attitudes or behavior patterns, the question should first be asked, to what extent does this pattern of behavior represent customary or expected behavior in the client's home community? For example, if a female client appears to manifest a high degree of hostility towards men, it is most important to know how, quotes, abnormal this is, to know whether she comes from a cultural background in which the concept of men as, quotes, no good represents a prevalent attitude. If the degree of hostility appears to be greatly beyond what would be expected in this milieu, then a diagnosis of abnormal would be tenable. And he goes on to discuss the question of the guilt, that there is not sufficient guilt in relation to illegitimate children and so forth. I think I've tried to say enough to say that part of our understanding of the addict group needs to be some clear evaluation of the working class cultures in terms of its own worthwhileness, and to be able not to label automatically pathological as simply what may be different. I did not have time to read, I did not receive a copy of Dr. Way's paper, and I did not have a chance to therefore prepare myself for it. I found it a most provocative and interesting discussion of a situation there, and I think it may eventually be a very interesting study for comparison of why, with similar laws, there is a different situation in Britain and in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bill. I'm going to call next on Dr. Alfred Friedman, Professor of Psychiatry and Chairman of the Department, New York Medical College.
Dr. Breslau, Mr. Wilkins, and Dr. Way. I'm really in bad shape here because I know Dr. Breslau well, and he's a very tough chairman. So my remarks will be unfortunately brief, considering the rich repast that we have already been privileged to hear. I think both these papers are most particularly informative and stimulating. Mr. Wilkins' paper was particularly stimulating or informative to me because it places finally in real context the questions that have risen concerning the so-called English system. At the time of the President's narcotic conference, the White House conference, I was on a panel, I think almost sitting between Dr. Henry Brill and Dr. Edwin Schur, who's written the book on the British system. And they directly contradicted each other in their observations made during the same period of time in England. And it was quite an interesting and somewhat furious battle for a while. And I think that what Mr. Wilkins has pointed out to me is how you have to observe and think of what occurs in England in the context of the culture, the traditions, the mores of the country. And I must say, in general, he tends to confirm the things that Dr. Schur said about the practices in England. I think what it means is that for any study, we must go into the complexities of the situation, study the background, the very structure and fabric of the society. It sometimes gets boring when one raises such questions and tends to delay answers, but I think this is necessary. I'm always reminded on these questions of the story of the two biostatisticians that meet in the institution in the elevator, and one says to the other, "How's your wife?" And the second one replies, "Compared to what?" But I think this sort of approach is really extremely necessary and cannot be avoided. The whole understanding of the structure of our society and the opinions expressed, we have stated in our own studies, and I think it confirms what is implicit in stated by Mr. Wilkins, that the stereotype of the addict is engendered in many ways because of the community's ambivalent and punitive attitudes, and that these attitudes in and of themselves limit the adaptive behavior or the opportunities and the alternatives that the addict can utilize, and therefore his behavior becomes rather fixed. And also, in many ways, our very practices have made the development of particular forms of behavior necessary. So in a way, we are seeing, I guess, what Merton refers to as a self-fulfilling prophecy. I have I guess those of you who heard me yesterday have been rather riding a kick in comparing smoking with narcotic addiction. And I think it is extremely important because if history had been somewhat different, we could well see where we might be having sort of an underground in cigarette smoking, because after all it is dangerous, it has addictive qualities, and very much of our own practice has made it necessary for certain patterns of behavior to occur. And we are familiar of the perception. Crime itself is looked upon differently. Many have reported the fact that in many communities, a Negro committing a crime against another Negro is treated as a triviality, while a crime of Negro versus white is quite different, the same crime, but they are viewed in a different context. White-collar crime is quite, takes enormous toll on the economy, yet is treated quite differently than other forms. I can go on at great length upon many of these things. I think particularly the relationship, the perceptions, as they influence our handling of the addict. But I do know time is short. I would like to ask Mr. Wilkins, we have heard much of the possible effects of migration from Africa and the West Indies on the possible rise in narcotic addiction. Would you say that the very structure and attitudes of England would tend to modulate or prevent any development of of the patterns that we see here? I think that what one learns from these two talks is that here we have the same laws and there are different practices. I think for us here, it means that I believe we must address ourselves really to the problems of the addict in our own culture today in the United States. We must study them carefully and learn the pathogenesis, the etiology, the relationship of the structure of society, as well as the individual characteristics. Because I think we get stimulation and get new perspectives from what goes on elsewhere, but we cannot translate patterns immediately to our own problems. There's great need for action research, tying in observations and feeding them back and altering our methods of treatment. We have to get really engaged with the problems rather than, I think, spending too much time talking about them, and those who are really involved with the addicts to experiment, and those who are not really to get involved with them. There are many questions. Our feelings that there is definitely an addict subculture, or that all addicts are the same, I think are open to serious question. And our own work, I know Dr. Chine has reported, we see definite typology of addicts, and that, for example, 25% of the addicts we see lead relatively conventional lives and actually have little criminality, and many of their contacts have never had any contact with any law enforcement or even health officials.